Good evening. It's a well-known fact that you never step into the same river twice. Dr. Phil Talon, to whom we're all much indebted for organising this evening's events, suggested I open proceedings, and this is only a very kind of preliminary talk, it'll only last about 20 minutes. He suggested I open proceedings by addressing this topic, the current state of Lewis scholarship, and this I am very happy to do, though I am aware that by its very nature, the current state of anything is current. It's running, it's flowing, it's surging, it's proceeding, and a state is, by definition, something static, something stationary, something still. So a current state is really a contradiction in terms. If you can never step into the same river twice, you can't really step into the current state of anything even once. If you knew where it was standing, you wouldn't know how fast it was flowing. Heisenberg has something to say about this. You are probably here. And talking of Heisenberg makes me think of Erwin Schrödinger, who, did you know this? I didn't know this until earlier this week. Schrödinger came up with his famous thought experiment about the cat. You know, is the cat alive or dead? Is the cat in the box or out of the box? He came up with that famous thought experiment while he was C.S. Lewis's colleague at Magdalen College, Oxford, in 1935. So here's another nice little image. Wanted dead and alive, Schrödinger's cat. Likewise wanted Lewis's scholarship, current and static. Now, undaunted by the uncertainties that surround my topic, I shall venture to provide you with a brief snapshot. I'll only speak for about 20 minutes, and it will be a very personal brief snapshot at that. A snapshot of Lewis scholarship as I presently see it. I'll be interested to know what my colleagues on the panel make of it, and I won't be at all put out if they see it quite differently, because it will be a very subjective account, making no pretense to being comprehensive or authoritative. And I'm going to define current as meaning things that have happened in Lewis scholarship in the last 5.5 years. 5.5 years, roughly speaking, takes us back to the 50th anniversary of C.S. Lewis's death. And that anniversary, I think, marked a notable milestone in Lewis's reception and Lewis's scholarship. And not just a metaphorical milestone, but a literal stone as well. There was unveiled at Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey this memorial on the 50th anniversary of his death. Some of us were present on that occasion. And I think the 50 years from Lewis's death up until 2013 comprises a particular sort of epoch or era in Lewis scholarship when, the basic building blocks were being put in place. The biographies were being written, the principal manuscripts by C.S. Lewis were being edited. Some are still coming to light, but the main ones were got out in the first 5 decades. And, well, apart from anything else, Lewis's reputation survived his death. He didn't think that it necessarily would. In the months before his death, he had a friendly argument with Walter Hooper, in which Lewis said to Hooper, "After I die, people will stop reading my books. That always happens." And Walter Hooper said to him, No, they won't. And you know why they won't? Because your readers, your books are too good and your readers are not that stupid. And Walter Hooper likes to say that it's the only argument that he ever won with C.S. Lewis. Now, I mentioned this Lewis at Poets' Corner memorial because it gave rise to a book, which I had the privilege of co-editing with Peter Williams. And I think a copy or two are on sale outside. And this book itself is quite an interesting snapshot of Lewis's reception, Lewis's scholarship in the UK, at any rate. It's a funny book, this. I enjoyed putting it together, but it's not a typical book of essays. there are various strands of commemorative events wedged together in this book. So it's very various. We tried to make a virtue of the necessity of that variousness. There's all sorts of scholarly stuff from people like Rowan Williams and Malcolm Guite and Stephen Logan, famous figures at Cambridge University, and there are also popular blog posts from young and up-and-coming scholars like Sarah Clarkson. And I think that speaks to something of Lewis's effect, and indeed something of the nature of Lewis scholarship, that it is very various. I think it's much more various than, say, James Joyce scholarship, because Lewis has so many different angles to him, and he appeals to so many different audiences that he receives a lot of different treatments, and this book reflects that reality. One of the popular ways in which Lewis is continually, repeatedly treated in the popular press, in the public press, is through articles in Christianity Today. This is an article I wrote on the 50th anniversary of Lewis's death, How Lewis Lit the Way. 50 years after his death, the apologist shows us how to make a fuller case for faith. Though how many readers of Christianity Today smoke or approve of smoking, I don't know. So why they put this pipe on the front cover, I have no idea. So, in the 5.5 years since Lewis's death, what has happened? Well, all sorts of things have happened, and it is actually a very flourishing and fertile ground, I think, that we have to survey. All sorts of good and exciting things are happening and are about to happen. And different scholars are beginning to emerge in different corners of the territory. It's interesting to see how different scholars sort of get a corner and make it their own. Joel Heck, for instance, he's established himself as the authority on the chronology of Lewis's life. He has a website, Chronologically Jack, is that right? Chronologically Yours. Oh, Chronologically Lewis, sorry, yes. So if you want to know where Lewis was or what he was doing on any given day of his life, go to that website and you'll almost certainly find out. Charlie Starr, he's made an interesting speciality for himself out of Lewis's handwriting. He has studied the progression of Lewis's handwriting over the course of his life, because you know that nearly all of Lewis's books were handwritten to begin with. And he can tell you within a year or two, just by looking at a page of Lewis's handwriting, when it was written. Don King has made a speciality of Lewis's poetry. Steve Beebe at Texas State San Markos, he's writing more and more about Lewis as a communicator. He's working on a book on Lewis as a master communicator. Victor Rappert has talked and studied closely on the subject of Lewis on naturalism. William O'Flaherty has made something of a very peculiar aspect of scholarship, but quite an important one. Lewis's misquotations or false attributions of Lewis, which are, on memes, go round the world in 2 seconds, and everybody thinks that Lewis said something rather platitudinous, which of course he never did. And William has written this rather useful book, The Misquotable C.S. Lewis, which tracks down some of the grosser offenders. Then there are up-and-coming scholars like Jason Lepojärvi, the Finnish scholar who wrote an excellent doctorate on C.S. Lewis and love. I have the privilege of supervising 2 students at Oxford who are doing one a doctorate on Lewis and eschatology, another on Lewis and humour. And these are the first doctorates at Oxford on Lewis within the theology faculty, the very first. It's taken this long. There has been one other doctorate at Oxford on C.S. Lewis, but that was within the English faculty, not theology. I'm a bit more familiar, to be honest, with the British scene than the American one, and I've had the honour of examining some doctorates from British universities on Lewis and Norse mythology, King's College London student, Lewis on evangelism at the University of Manchester, A South African student at the University of Witwatersrand did a doctorate on that hideous strength, which I also examined at a distance. Unfortunately, they didn't fly me down to South Africa. I was annoyed about that. There is here at HBU a student, Josiah Peterson, who's recently done my own class, and he's hoping, if he can, to do a doctorate at Oxford on Lewis and the Socratic Club, which would be a great topic. And he would be well positioned to do it because he knows a lot about debate. And apart from Oxford and King's College London and Cambridge that I've already mentioned, within Britain, of course, there is also the University of St Andrews with its fantastic Institute for Theology, Imagination and the Arts. Dr. Talon and I are both products of St Andrews. This is my St Andrews tie. And that institute is fostering all sorts of interesting study on C.S. Lewis. One of the more notable examples is Sharon Jebb's doctorate on C.S. Lewis and Samuel Beckett. So that's a very, very brief overview of some of the things going on in Britain at the moment. Now, more generally, perhaps you have seen hot off the presses James Como's recent book, C.S. Lewis, A Very Short Introduction, Oxford University Press. This is a series of VSIs, very short introductions on all sorts of different topics, and it's quite an honor, finally, for Lewis to be included in their range of topics. It's basically a biography, this short work, and so let's talk a little bit about other biographies that have happened in the last 5 years or so. Perhaps the most notable is Alistair McGrath's C.S. Lewis, A Life, Eccentric Genius, Reluctant Prophet, which has a lot of useful and fairly new stuff to say about Lewis's reception within North America. That's a particularly good chapter at the end. Alistair McGrath also made great hay of redating Lewis's conversion to theism, something which he did more or less simultaneously with Andrew Lazo. Andrew and Alistair more or less simultaneously realized that Lewis had mistakenly dated his own conversion to theism, but Andrew and Alistair came at it from different angles, for different reasons, which shows you, the fruitfulness of scholarship if scholars independently of each other are coming to the same conclusions from different angles. Alistair McGrath, who teaches at Oxford, also recently came out with this book, The Intellectual World of C.S. Lewis, which I think is even better than the biography, actually. It's got 8 or 10 chapters dissecting different aspects of Lewis's thought world, a very worthwhile collection. But back to biographies. Another notable biography, this time of the Inklings as a group, came out recently by Philip and Carol Zaleski. A much-needed correction, I think, to the first study of the Inklings by Humphrey Carpenter, which came out in the 70s, and which is full of all sorts of questionable judgments and biases. Holly Ordway's forthcoming book on Tolkien is going to really sock it to Humphrey Carpenter on that score, about how he has misled us, really rather seriously, in all sorts of ways, especially with regard to Tolkien. Another sort of biographical book is this, C.S. Lewis and His Circle, Essays and Memoirs from the Oxford C.S. Lewis Society, of which I have the honour to be senior member, that is to say faculty supervisor. The C.S. Lewis Society at Oxford has been in existence since 1982. It meets every week during term time, and all sorts of different speakers have come over the decades, many of them who were close friends or personal colleagues with C.S. Lewis. So there's all sorts of biographical data in our archives, and the choicest examples were put together in this collection a few years ago. I wrote the afterword, and it's a good collection. Again, very various, as these sorts of symposia tend to be, but worth your while. Another product of the Oxford C.S. Lewis Society is the Journal of Inkling Studies. This grew out of the efforts of Brendan Wolfe and Judith Wolfe, who ran the society for several years, and it's now established itself as possibly the most highbrow of the journals on this in this field. It comes out twice a year. The most recent edition just came out last month, I think, and here's a sample of the contents. Norbert Feinendinger, the Feinendagen, The Philosopher's Progress, C.S. Lewis's Intellectual Journey from Atheism to Theism. Jonathan Lookadoo, A Preview of the Inklings, a note on the early correspondence of C.S. Lewis and Arthur Greaves. A review of Edith Humphreys' Further Up and Further In, Orthodox Conversations with C.S. Lewis on Scripture and Theology. That kind of thing goes in this journal. Another journal, of course, a longer-standing one, a better established one, is Seven, the Journal of the Marion E. Wade Center, Wheaton College, Illinois. That also has recently published its latest edition, and that has essays on Augustine and Lewis on friendship, a review essay by Brenton Dickinson of Monica Hilder's recent trilogy on C.S. Lewis and gender. It's a very well worth reading collection every time it comes out, but they've also recently supplemented it with some online articles. The third of the three journals on C.S. Lewis is the only one that is dedicated to Lewis exclusively. The Seven and the Journal of Inkling Studies are obviously about the Inklings as a group, but Sehnsucht is the C.S. Lewis journal. It focuses exclusively on Lewis. And again, the latest edition has just come out with articles on things like studies in words, miracles, Lewis on medieval cosmology, Lewis on hell, Lewis's work on behalf of prisoners of war during World War II, a review of Holly's book, Apologetics and the Christian Imagination, a fine journal. You see on the cover there, Magdalen College Tower, Magdalen, Oxford, where Lewis spent most of his career. And another nice thing, which is soon, I hope, to see the light of day, is a rather comic piece that Lewis wrote after he had served as vice president of Magdalen College in the early 1940s. It was always the duty of a senior fellow at Magdalen to become vice president for a year, and if they were any good, they would be elected for a second year. Lewis wasn't re-elected for his second year because he was so bad at it. He had no gift for bureaucracy and administration. And I think he was deliberately bad at it, actually, so that he wouldn't be re-elected. But anyway, the point I'm making is that at the end of your year as vice president, or the end of your 2 years as vice president, you write an account in the college ledger, this huge, great leather-bound book which goes back centuries. And the earliest records were written in Latin. It's so old. And usually they're just now, a fairly tedious list of meetings held and decisions taken. Lewis, of course, decided to write a 5-act play under the title The Tragi-Comical Brief Reign of Lewis the Bald. And I have read the first 4 acts of this 5-act drama. The 5th act was withheld from me so that I would, maintain an interest. The former Dean of Divinity at Magdalen, Oxford, Michael Pirret, is working on a kind of scholarly edition of this play, which is going to be published as a Magdalen occasional paper, but it hasn't appeared yet. But talking of Oxford makes me think of that other Oxford and indeed Cambridge figure, Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, who recently published this little book, The Lion's World, A Journey into the Heart of Narnia. It was based on 3 lectures that he gave during Holy Week a few years back at Canterbury Cathedral when he was still Archbishop. And Rowan Williams, of course, is a major theologian, a major public intellectual, at least in the UK. I'm not sure what kind of profile he has over here. And for a man of his stature to seriously interact with Lewis in this kind of way indicates, I think, the increasing stature that Lewis has in the intellectual world of his home nation. He's always been better appreciated this side of the Atlantic. And another notable American academic, George Marsden, recently came out with this excellent book, I think. It's a biography of Lewis's Mere Christianity. Very well worth reading, I think. Probably the best single study of Mere Christianity. Now, the rest of this talk is really just going to be a sort of annotated brief list of notable works that just came to mind as I was putting together this talk. I'm sorry if it's not much more than a series of front covers, but there's only so much you can do when talking about a subject like this, and I'll shut up in a minute in any case, and then we can have more interesting conversation on the panel. But a few other notable works to mention: The Inklings and King Arthur, edited by Serena Higgins, with another fine piece by Holly Ordway. The Arthurian treatments of Tolkien, Williams, Lewis, and Barfield on the matter of Britain haven't received really much scholarly attention at all until this book. And it's a big, fat book. It's pretty comprehensive. Well worth your consideration if you're into Arthuriana. I want to mention our other colleague on the panel, Lou Markos, and his book, An Apologist, C.S. Lewis, An Apologist for Education. Again, I see a copy or two are on sale outside. Lewis as educational theorist is a topic which is receiving more and more attention, especially in America, given the growth in the homeschooling movement. So we've talked about myself and my colleagues on the panel. I ought also really to mention some of the students here tonight and their excellent journal, An Unexpected Journal. Again, copies are available outside, and modesty should forbid, but I can't help but show you this front cover. This is the journal the students, the former students and former students put out just before Christmas, marking the first decade of Planet Narnia, which was not just a puff piece, I'm pleased to say. There were some articles engaging it from a more critical standpoint, which I was pleased to see. And another HBU product, Daniel Ray, has done good work on cosmological matters himself, and he's been co-editing this book, The Story of the Cosmos, How the Heavens Declare the Glory of God. That will see the light of day in a couple of months' time. Taking a little bit of a swerve into an area which is not directly on Lewis, but which is so closely connected to Lewis that I think we ought to pay it some attention. Two biographies on people very significant in Lewis's life. The first, Charles Williams, the Third Inkling. This is a pretty magisterial biography that came out a few years ago by Greville Lindop, who spent 10 years writing it. It's not a hatchet job, but it is a deeply disturbing book. It unearths all sorts of aspects about Williams's life and beliefs and relationships, which gives you significant pause, I think that's fair to say. And it makes you wonder how much C.S. Lewis really knew about those aspects of Williams's life. Almost equally unsettling is this biography of Joy Davidman by Abigail Santamaria. Lewis's wife here receives her first full-scale biographical treatment, and it's very well written, very well researched. Again, not a hatchet job, but it's written so honestly that you can't help but ask some serious questions about Joy and about Lewis's relationship with her. Recently discovered was a series of sonnets that Joy wrote to C.S. Lewis, which had lain in a dusty attic for 50 years. And they've now been published and edited by Don King, A Naked Tree, Love Sonnets to C.S. Lewis and Other Poems. And these really are fantastic. They're very good poems in themselves, but they're also extremely interesting in telling us more about Joy's own psychology and the nature of her relationship with C.S. Lewis. Bandersnatch. This is a book by Diana Pavlak-Glyer, which is the popularization of her more scholarly work, The Company They Keep, C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien as writers in community. I've popularized Planet Narnia as the Narnia Code, and Diana has done similarly with her parent book, The Company They Keep, writing Bandersnatch for a younger audience, an audience that doesn't want all the detail and footnotes. You know, we're encouraged increasingly in academia to have academic impact. That always has to be measured. We don't just want to be speaking at the ivory tower level, but we want to be, going out to the highways and the byways and getting our thoughts into the wider culture. And this is a fine example of Diana Glyer doing just that. And I find that I'm now moving into more populist territory, so I suppose I ought to speak not just about books, but also DVDs and TV documentaries. Here's one that recently came out, Tolkien and Lewis, Myth, Imagination, and the Quest for Meaning, which I think has been broadcast in this country on PBS not so long ago. And I'm sure you're aware that there's this forthcoming Tolkien biopic about to hit the silver screen in a month or two's time. Here's another documentary, The Fantasy Makers, Faith in Imagination, Tolkien, Lewis and MacDonald. Both of these, I think, are well worth your attention. I had the honour of being interviewed in both of them, so I know a little bit about what they're trying to say, and it's worth, it's a worthwhile enterprise. And while we're talking about sort of popular impact and Lewis's place in the wider culture, I want to show you this still. It's a screenshot from the recent movie The Fault in Our Stars, which came out, I think, in 2014, based on a book by John Green, the novel with the same title, The Fault in Our Stars. And anyway, the heroine of this story has a particular thing about this book, An Imperial Affliction. She's always referring to it. And at one point in the movie, she fishes it off her bookshelf in her bedroom, and then you see next to it C.S. Lewis, Out of the Silent Planet, Perelandra, and That Hideous Strength. Whoever had the responsibility for dressing the set of that movie thought, The Fault in Our Stars. What do I know about stars? Oh, I know, C.S. Lewis. He wrote a trilogy all about interplanetary adventures. Let's put that alongside. I was delighted to see that. I thought, how unlikely that C.S. Lewis's relatively little-known work of the 1930s and 40s should get into this mainstream Hollywood movie. It's quite a good movie, too. It's worth seeing. At a much lower level, in Britain we have, as you probably know, tabloid newspapers, red-top tabloid newspapers, which are not much more than gossip columns, and they always like having terrible puns in their headlines. And so last year, someone posted on my Facebook page the day's front page of the Sun newspaper, which is the widest circulation newspaper in the UK. And what was the banner headline on the front page of the Sun? The Liar, the Swish, and the Whore Probe. Now there's glory for you. I think, Lewis can rest easy, knowing that his marvelous fairy tale is now being spun in this particularly gross and perverse way. But more seriously, and on these two notes I must end. Lewis scholarship in the United States was really begun, I think it is fair to say, by Clyde Kilby, an English professor at Wheaton College. It was he who set up the Wade Center at Wheaton, and his work in this field, not just with Lewis but also with Tolkien, has done an immeasurable amount to raise their profile in the US. And it's interesting that the Wade Center at Wheaton has recently gone back into the Kilby archives and selected the best things that he wrote and published them as this book, A Well of Wonder, Essays on Lewis, Tolkien, and the Inklings. So Kilby, being dead, yet he speaketh. Very right and proper too, I think. Today is March the 27th. And how marvellous that it is the birthday of Walter Hooper. Today he turns 88. And Hooper, I think, even more than Clyde Kilby, owes our thanks for generating the whole field of Lewis scholarship. Hooper became Lewis's secretary in the last few months of Lewis's life, and then he became the editor of Lewis's posthumous body of work. So almost any collection of Lewisiana that you will have read, it almost certainly was edited by this man. He's worked on the poetry, on the diaries, on the juvenilia, on the essays, God in the Dock and all those famous collections. They were put together by this man. Lewis scholarship just would not be what it is without the efforts of Walter Hooper. And even in 2013, even on the 50th anniversary of Lewis's death, Walter was still at it, bringing out this fine collection, Image and Imagination, which is the full collection of Lewis's work as a reviewer. But probably Walter's greatest work was the editing of the collected letters, 3 volumes. A really magisterial effort. It almost killed him, he said, when he was working on these. And without easy access to all of Lewis's letters, modern Lewis scholarship just wouldn't be in the situation it is. This is an absolute treasure trove. And so on Walter Hooper's 88th birthday, I think we have a fine example of the sort of career you can have in Lewis scholarship. And there is still plenty to be done. Walter has had, the first strike, as it were, at the cream of the crop, but there are many corners still to be filled in. And perhaps in the panel we will discuss some of the openings or the gaps that remain in Lewis scholarship. And on that note, I will show you this rather amusing newspaper cartoon. This isn't Narnia, wardrobe malfunction. Let's see whether there are ways of correcting any such malfunctions in Lewis scholarship as we turn over to the panel. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure now to pick up from this thread of the conversation, and having had the groundwork laid. And I must say, I knew what our students were doing in HBU Apologetics, but it was a real treat to just see it laid out there with the front covers and everything. It's just nice, well done to our students, and I think that's particularly fitting for the theme of this panel about future directions in Lewis studies, because our students, while still students, or when the ink is practically still wet in their diplomas, they are contributing. And I think that's a very encouraging sign that there's lots to be done, people who are interested in doing it, and people who are doing it. So, very good. So one of the things that comes to mind in looking at the future of Lewis studies is we had in Michael's presentation some examples of academic work and some examples of popular work. And I'm wondering if any of you have anything to say about the kind of the intersection between those two areas. Where might there be some popularizations of academic work, or where is there a need to bring the academic work into the popular realm along the lines of Narnia Code or Bandersnatch that hasn't been done yet? Where do we see some opportunities for future academic popular interface?
I think it's great because, again, every niche keeps getting filled, and I'm always reviewing these books. And one book that stuck in my mind that I thought was a gap that we didn't realize was C.S. Lewis on the natural law. Because when Lewis speaks of the Tao in Abolition of Man, it's pretty much the natural law. And again, it was great to see writers who were coming at it from a little bit of political science, a little bit of theology and philosophy, and even history, because they were trying to show how Lewis was partly responding to Karl Barth, which I hadn't thought about before, but he was partly responding to that. And so to find a niche where Lewis can actually speak not only to English professors and scholars, but can actually speak to people who deal with public policy and natural law and what that means. And so every time I turn around, there's something about being a good creative writer, what Lewis can teach us. Another one I really enjoyed was Lewis, what he learned from Dante. And it could have been just a list of Trivial Pursuit, but it wasn't. It showed us how much Dante is layered through Lewis. And what I see coming and what I like is there are still the naysayers out there in academia about Lewis. And one thing I like to say is that the more you know of the canon, the more you know the great books, the more you know the tradition, the more you will respect Lewis. And that's where I want to see the interface between the academic and the more public is something, doing the great books like we do here. That Lewis is completely invested in Lewis and brought together in a way that he has devoured the tradition and given it to us.
And I think that'll be particularly interesting with the rise of classical Christian schools that are really drawing out, which is a trend that I think is excellent. And I think that kind of popular drawing on Lewis to make that connection would be a real boon to people in that field. Yeah.
I think coming at it from a different angle, I think Lewis really filters his way into pop culture in kind of surprising corners. there's a U2 video where they're cartoon characters. They made a video of the song "Hold Me, Kiss Me, Kill Me, Thrill Me," "Hold Me, Kill Me," and Bono is walking along reading a book, and a car comes swerving by him in this cartoon and knocks it out of his hand, and it's the Screwtape Letters. You're seeing Lewis kind of filter his way into kind of popular culture. I love the C.S. Lewis and books. Right. I have a whole section of my bookshelf, Lewis and Natural Law, Lewis and Communications. But I like how he's getting into pop culture. Max McLean and his adaptations of Lewis's Screwtape Letters, Most Reluctant Convert, Great Divorce, have been in front of 500,000 people. Nancy Pelosi, I understand, just came to hear Screwtape not long ago. The video stuff, Joe LeConte's book being turned into a 5-part series, A Hobbit, a Wardrobe, and a Great War. Recently, Patty Callahan Henry has done a novel called Becoming Mrs. Lewis. And so it's not scholarly, but she has done a yeoman's work of scholarly research. And she knows her stuff very well, but she writes exclusively from Joy's perspective and in the first person. And it's a marvelous thing. I'm working with her on the paperback edition soon to come out. And she just told me last week at a podcast we were doing together that she's starting to talk to some film or TV people. And so I think that some of these things are starting to filter through. Netflix, I believe, picked up Narnia and bought the whole thing. And there's a couple of Tolkien film projects coming out. So I think that there are these Lewis ands, there are these pop culture things. But I think that one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is trying to get my arms around it all. And I think that particularly the work that Michael has done and the work that Diana Glyer has done are really kind of invitations to try and see Lewis as the whole of him, not as if we'll ever get to the bottom of him.
Yeah, there's so much that could be said, both good and bad. And as we've talked a fair bit about the good, let me raise a sort of warning flag about some of the less desirable ways in which this can go. My colleague on their Cambridge companion to C.S. Lewis, Rob McSwain, who teaches at Sewanee, he wrote in that book about what he calls jacksploitation. You know the term blaxploitation? Well, jacksploitation is the exploiting of Jack for commercial gain or just to get some sort of street cred or, you know, once you've attached Lewis's name to something, it must be okay, mustn't it? Because, you know, we all like C.S. Lewis. And that can be very crude, very mercenary if you're not careful. And I think, you know, we need to maintain some standards against that sort of mercenary attitude. I won't name specific examples that I have in mind. That would be uncharitable. But I'm sure you're aware of the sort of thing I'm talking about.
Yeah, and one of the things that comes to mind are all those books and I don't even have to have a particular one in mind to think of, you know, surprised by X, surprised by Y.
Yes, an X observed. Yes, or mere X. Yes.
Yeah, kill me now. You know, we've had plenty of those. And that also brings to mind the question of sorry, I've completely lost the train of thought that I had for a moment going there.
Well, what were your notes saying?
Yes, well, my notes were saying we're looking at the connection between, you know, academic work, popular work, and Andrew was noting that we want to kind of get the fuller picture. And one of the things that comes up when you, again, think about that fuller picture, we have a problem that can arise with Lewis scholarship when people try to approach Lewis as if he agreed with them in all of their points. So, for instance, taking Lewis from a particular denominational standpoint that isn't his own and trying to say, well, you know, and this is actually an equal opportunity flaw. I see people try to make Lewis into an evangelical Protestant, and I've seen people try to make Lewis into a Catholic. But he was, as he insisted, a layman of the Church of England in a particular time period in which being a member of the Church of England was theologically somewhat different than it is today. And so I think that can be an issue as well, that we need to watch out for ways in which we're only looking at part of Lewis, and then we're interpreting him according to what we wish he had said, and we have to look at what he actually said, not what he would have said if he were an evangelical, what he would have said if he was a Catholic, what he would have said if he was Eastern Orthodox. I think that's one of the things that we need to watch out for.
Yeah.
I think also Jerry Root, the author of The Quotable Lewis and C.S. Lewis and a Problem of Evil at Wheaton College, is very clear in calling people to only say what they can prove, if they only speak definitively when they can provide definitive proof. So Lewis would have can be a very dangerous statement. And then one of the things I see a lot is, well, Lewis was a widely read man, he must have read. And so I'm saying go and summon up the copy of the book from his library, and so it's easy to kind of, like you said, make Lewis malleable into what you want him to do. I think another question I'd like to hear your thoughts on is, and I'm grateful for some of the progress that have been made at looking at Lewis and his relationship with women, whether it's with his wife Joy, and there's been a great deal of stuff about that.
Well, again, in this case, we have Lewis and Tolkien are both kind of in the same boat, because people often, they see what they want to see. And they project onto Lewis or Tolkien what they want. And that might be they project onto him misogyny, or it might be that they project onto Lewis, in particular, a kind of nascent feminism. And he doesn't fit either category. He just doesn't, that's not how he's approaching the subject. So I think that whenever we're trying to generalize about someone's attitude towards women, I think that can get out of hand pretty quickly, because in the end, it's not so much what did he think about women, it's how did he relate to the women in his life, how did he portray them in his fiction, how did he treat them in his own work. And that's, I think, where we need to be good scholars, and as you said, look at the evidence and not just say, well, he must have. One of the things that is an example that particularly annoys me is when people look at That Hideous Strength and they take the part about at the end where Jane is told, don't have dreams, have children instead, and people say, oh, Lewis, the misogynist, telling her not to have dreams, not to have ambitions, that she should just be barefoot and pregnant. Well, actually, the dreams in the context of the story are referring to the nightmare precognitive dreams that she's having, and it's a reassuring statement that this has been resolved. You're no longer going to have these dreams. You are now, reestablished your marriage with Mark, so now you can be fruitful in this way. We've already seen that she isn't interested in finishing her dissertation. It's just she's bored by it at the beginning of the book. So that's a case where that particular line is often taken out of context and misread as an example of Lewis's misogyny when it completely isn't.
And I think that the solution to a lot of that, especially when Lewis was racist or Lewis was sexist, generally the solution, and if our audience members get these kinds of questions, the solution is reading Lewis carefully. If you will read what he actually said and read his actual words carefully, all of those kind of quick attacks, kind of drift away. I want
to come over to Michael on this, because you've had the occasion to deal with people who claim that Lewis was sexist because of how he portrays women in Narnia, and I wonder if you might speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I was put up against Philip Pullman in a public debate in Oxford a few years ago. And Pullman, as you probably know, the author of the Dark Materials trilogy and works like The Good Man Jesus and The Scoundrel Christ. He's wanting to do through his own fantastic fiction for his non-religious or atheistical cause what he believes, quite rightly, Lewis did for his Christian cause. And anyway, because of his attacks on Narnia, I was put up against him. And Philip Pullman is a very formidable debater. He sort of wiped the floor with me, though I managed to get a few belated comebacks in my book, Planet Narnia. The French have a phrase for esprit d'escalier, the spirit of the stairs, when you think as you're going downstairs afterwards, oh, I should have said that. So I've put some of those thoughts into Planet Narnia. But yes, but anyway, what about scholarship on this subject? It's a very tricky topic because it quickly gets caught up with politics, and Lewis or Tolkien or whoever it may be just becomes a battering ram for or against your chosen position, and the actual facts of the matter get lost by the wayside. So that's where true scholarship, careful academic scholarship, which will not feed out into the public domain immediately, it takes a while to trickle down, that's where it is so vital.
I think a good analogy here, we teach a lot of Flannery O'Connor here, and she wrote a famous story, Everything That Rises Must Converge. And it's a mother and a son. And it's in the South during segregation. And as you start to have the characters developed, you find that the mother is, in one sense, a product of her time. She does maybe have some prejudices, but she actually has a lot of black friends that she's close to, and she's sincere. And then her son is all these radical ideas, but he doesn't have a single black friend because nobody wants to be friends with him because he's only using them to feel good about himself. Now, the reason I use that as an analogy, and it's something that you just said, Holly, is how does Lewis actually treat women in real life? Most of his letters were to women. How does he portray people like Lucy and others? Let's look at how he actually acts. I'm not interested in his time period, but how he treats people. And I think there Lewis shows himself to be sincere.
And that's where the scholarship really comes in. And as you noted, Michael, the importance of Walter Hooper's collection of the letters, that we don't have to say, oh, I wonder what Lewis might have said if women had written to him. We can look it up. we can find out. So this question of the engagement between the academic and the popular leads me to another question that I want to raise, which is we've been considering areas of scholarship related to Lewis. Topics or subjects, but I think it's interesting also to consider application of his ideas. And I want to give a couple examples of that. One is, for instance, I know of a project that's using the Chronicles of Narnia as a teaching tool in, I think it's elementary schools, to teach virtue. And so that's an application where it's not about the Chronicles of Narnia, but they're using the Narnia Chronicles in order to teach virtue. As another example, my own book, Apologetics and the Christian Imagination, I do a big section on the use and misuse of language and on verbicide, the way that words can be distorted from their real meaning to mean even opposite things. And my own work on that was very strongly shaped by Lewis's Studies in Words, which is a book which I think is not nearly as appreciated as it ought to be. It's a fantastically important book. But here we see, and I quote it in my book, and that was a case of applying what I had learned from Lewis in Studies in Words and kind of taking his method and applying it to my particular context, which was imaginative apologetics. And so I'm wondering if we have any other examples that come to mind of either work that has recently been done that does this, or maybe some ways in which you could see areas that it could be done, that perhaps we have some students out there who are thinking of their capstone project, with me in a year's time that might be doing things like this.
What I'm seeing, especially in Presbyterian circles, and whenever I want to press a Calvinist, I just say C.S. Lewis said, and they listen, because most of the classical Christian movement is coming out of Reformed churches, and most of you know John Piper. His Desiring God is very, very influenced by Lewis, and I'm trying to remember, I think it was C.S. Lewis, the rationalist religion. I'm trying to remember the title, but again, it's part of the whole Desiring God movement and trying to provoke change in people, not only to become more virtuous, but to become more joyous. And there's some really good books in that series, and there's other people, but Lewis is one of them, and I reviewed that book a while ago. And again, it's showing how Lewis can lead us into a fuller Christian life, not only theologically, but in terms of joy, just existentially in terms of joy. And I thought that was a good example, a unique use of Lewis.
Yeah, that's definitely using him, applying his, in this case, almost his biographical model. Right. Yeah.
I think that there's a great clue in the first of the Screwtape letters, where the Screwtape tries to divorce the patient from a line of reasoning and a line of action. And Lewis connected so intimately and so immediately what he believed with how it changed his behavior, right? He began going to church before he was even a Christian because he said, I thought one ought to fly one's flag. In the work that I've been doing on Till We Have Faces, the discovery that I've been making that stands on the shoulders of your work, certainly, is I don't think that Lewis was as concerned with joy, but as he says at the end of Surprised by Joy, it serves only as a signpost to something other and outer. And I think what Lewis was really concerned with was love. And as I've been digging deep into this last novel, which is about love, it all of a sudden has kind of shifted tectonically how I see Lewis, because he's concerned with love all the time. There's the story, I think it was in Warney, that Lewis comes in from a walk, and he's telling him about a farmer that he had seen lying by the field, and he jumps up and he says, oh no, I've committed a sin against charity. And he goes and he gets the farmer and, helps to revive him. I think that this connection of what he believes with what he does kind of comes down to the two great commandments. And as I've been kind of studying love in Lewis, and Jason Lippa-Yarvy's done marvelous work on this, I think that that's the gravitational center of Lewis, and that in some ways makes everything start to make sense and take its proper place, especially because those are the great commandments, right? And so I think that that's some of what's going on, especially this connection with thinking and doing something about it.
I mentioned that I'm supervising a couple of doctorates at Oxford, and one of my students, Jardiel Perez, he's studying Lewis on humour. Well, he's studying a theology of humour with special reference to C.S. Lewis, and I suppose he's an example, possibly, of the kind of application that you're talking about. Lewis wrote a bit about humour, not very much. You couldn't say that he's, a theorist of humour. He wasn't a comedian either. He wasn't a, particular practitioner of the comedic arts. Though he was, perfectly capable of being funny, and he had a good sense of humour. But hopefully most of us have that. That doesn't mean you want to write a PhD on us. But I think what my student is trying to do is, in addition to all the obviously, ostensibly relevant material in Lewis's works, he's actually taking the shape of Lewis's life and theology, and using that as a kind of frame of reference for his larger argument. Lewis going through the darkness of his atheist years, his teens and his 20s, and coming out into his Christian belief in his 30s. That movement from darkness to light is, in a sense, a sort of paradigm appropriate for an analysis of humour. The sudden shaft of light, which catches you unaware, makes you blink, makes you sneeze, comes at you unexpectedly somewhat. That's in some ways the essence of humour. So look at Lewis's life in that way, and look, I see, right, a Christian conversion is a kind of joke, a blessed joke. So that's an application which I think is coming to the fore increasingly in my student's work as he progresses.
And this also brings to mind one point that I wanted to raise about the interdisciplinary nature of Lewis studies, and certainly that's the case in our apologetics program. It's an interdisciplinary program, but even in what Michael, you've raised in your presentation, there's biography, there's theology, there's literary criticism. There's a lot of things going on there. You've talked about the very first PhD in Lewis was in the English faculty, and now you're supervising two that are in the theology faculty. And I think one of the things that I've observed in the 50th anniversary celebrations, in the memorial at Poets Corner, and in the subsequent years, has been a bit more attention to the different elements of Lewis. He isn't just an apologist. He isn't just a writer of Narnia. He's also a literary critic. He's also a literary historian. He's done these other things. And I think that one of the areas that we don't have much on is that intersection, that consideration of the way, for instance, that how is C.S. Lewis in writing Mere Christianity, for instance, how is that shaped by the fact that his magnum opus was the both the Oh Hell volume on the English drama. Those two things don't necessarily seem to go together very well, and I'm wondering if, especially Michael, if you have any thoughts either on what has been done recently in interdisciplinary work, or maybe some really fruitful points where these different fields are coming together. We've talked about Lewis and with different subjects, but what about the ands within his own scope that haven't been touched on enough yet?
Well, can you help me out? I haven't got any immediate thoughts on that topic. What do you think?
One thing I'd like to see more of is Lewis. I think it's in Preface to Paradise Lost, the need to restore our stock responses to things, and I think we could see that drawn all the way across if we could. And I think Lewis would want it to be taken all across. That we've lost a sense of just good and bad, what should disgust us, what should make us proud. We need to have that restored to us in psychology, in ethics, in literature, in academics, and all those areas. And I mean, who was it that said, everything Lewis ever knew went into everything he ever wrote? Barfi. And I think this generation's realizing that more. They're starting to realize you can't just read Narnia or just read apologetics or just read the literary criticism. You have to see how it all comes together. And one thing I'm seeing that excites me is people I just spoke for our academy. That's our classical Christian school here, part of HBU. And I encourage them that the Inklings was a group of Christians that got together, but they didn't come together for a Bible study. They came together to encourage each other to write works that were maybe unfashionable at the time, but that would really be salt and light in the world. And I'm seeing that Diana Glyer has tried, I think you've done that too, trying to get us to encourage each other to have the courage to do things like Lewis writing popular works. Everybody thinks that Lewis never got his professorship because he was Christian. That's part of it, but it was more that he wrote popular work outside of his area of specialization. And so Lewis is going to help us create generalists, Renaissance men, people that want to take what Lewis did and imitate him and build a new kind of community.
And I'm particularly glad you made that point about stock responses, because that's an instance of that very fruitful intersection. Because here we have Lewis in one of his works of straight-up literary criticism, Preface to Paradise Lost. And that same point comes up in Abolition of Man, where he's talking about the responses that we're supposed to have. And Abolition of Man is a very philosophical work. And yet, we don't properly understand Abolition of Man if we're not also kind of getting that connection. So I think that's a fruitful connection, seeing the way that the literary and the philosophical can really come together to give us a richer understanding of a particular idea.
The only way that we could think that Satan is the hero of Paradise Lost is if we've lost our stock responses to betrayal and treachery. And I don't want to get political, but we could take that into all other areas. We've lost a sense of right and wrong.
There's two things I want to touch on. The Inklings, we have to remember, were not just about reading manuscripts, but they were about drinking beer.
Tell this to the Baptists over here.
Yes, and smoking pipes and having good talk, what Lewis famously describes in the Philia chapter, the golden sessions. But one must not discount the fact of the beer, because I think implicit in that is the sacramental nature of all eating and drinking, right? This idea that one can in the exchange of food and drink, find something. And I think that was a real kernel, that it was a fellowship, that it was like Tolkien famously says, I love showing up at the Beer and the Babe and hearing the roar and knowing that one can jump right in, right? The tussle of them living daily life and doing the kind of things that they loved. I think that the other piece of it is, yes, the magnum opus was Oh Hell, but far and away his best book was Till We Have Faces. And by his own account, and we're not sure exactly what he meant by that, but what he does there is, I think, kind of pull everything together. Every book that I've read by Lewis is in that book. And it has this kind of holistic nature. And I think it has something to do with that great letter in 1955 to Carl F.H. Henry, the editor of Christianity Today, who evidently writes asking for more essays, maybe apologetics. We don't have that side of the correspondence. And he says, I'm sorry, I won't be able to write your articles for you. My thoughts and talents, such as they are given to other, though not less Christian, directions, and I will no longer be writing any more directly theological pieces. Such talents I have are given to catching the reader unawares through fiction and symbol. So he's still doing theology, but he's relishing the fact that he's doing indirect theology, and fighting as vigorously as ever he did. And he integrated his apologetics from the 40s, as you've discussed very well, with his fiction, with Two Faces and the Chronicles of Narnia. And so I think this integrated, holistic personality is what some of the recent scholarship is helping us to see Lewis as, and then help us to see Lewis in that light that he was holistic, not just writing about this or that.
Yeah, to come back to your point about interdisciplinariness, I think, building on what Andrew just said, yes, he turned increasingly in later years to sort of theologically informed narrative. But I think even earlier, he had been working in poetically informed theology. This is what I'm always. This is the drum I'm always banging when people want to come to Oxford and study Lewis as a theologian, because there's a big debate about to what extent was Lewis a theologian. He never studied theology formally. He never taught theology formally. But clearly he was a theological writer of great import and great impact. But what was the central contribution of C.S. Lewis to theology? It wasn't so much the content of what he said. He didn't pretend to be original. He didn't want to be original in any fashion. But he turned out to be quite original simply, I think, because of the ways in which he wrote. He just was a poet, first and foremost, who knew how language worked, who knew how symbols and metaphors worked. And it's that metaphorical approach to theology which I think is his chief contribution. And that's not been sufficiently studied. Our time is nearly up.
And that was the last thing that I wanted to ask very brief. And I'm just going to ask you, Michael, because we do want to turn it over to Q&A. So if you were to say, what was maybe the one gap that you'd like to see filled?
Yes, the biggest gap I think there is in Lewis scholarship is Lewis the classicist. Lewis studied classics more intently by the age of 16 than most of us in this room have studied classics in the whole course of our lives. And because classical education is, by which I mean, ancient Greece and ancient Rome, that kind of classics, because that is so little taught these days, we're missing all sorts of things in C.S. Lewis. And I speak as much about myself as about anybody else, because my own classical education is very weak. And I wish a true classicist would come along and write a big fat book on Lewis as the classicist.
All right, well, thank you to my panelists. And so now I want to open up for some Q&A. And is Dr. Talon around here somewhere? He's at the back. Could we give one of the mics to you, and so you could give it to our person to do Q&A, and would you figure out when is the last question we should take?
Okay, yeah, I'll give you that. Who'd like to go first?
Yes.
Who'd like to go second?
I have a question over there.
Thank you. You may have noticed my generation, our form of communication is mostly audio-visual and digital, for better and for worse. I think that the love of reading and the art of reading is something that we should strive to propagate. But in the face of film, particularly being somewhat of a more palatable media, what do you think about film adaptations of works by Lewis, the most famous of which being the Chronicles? But also, what do you think are elements of the Space Trilogy which might lend themselves to a film adaptation versus maybe some aspects of that series that would not lend itself well to a film adaptation? Thank you.
I mean, Out of the Silent Planet is pretty straightforward science fiction. I think they could do that pretty well, but then it gets heavier and heavier and heavier.
Especially with the nudity.
Yeah, that's true. I didn't think about that. That's right, Paralandra would be difficult. But I think they could start with Out of the Silent Planet and do something very effective. I would hope.
Lewis was a medievalist, and he knew that the job of a medieval author was to take an old story and to chop off the bits he didn't like and build up the bits he did and pass it along. And I think that, arguably, I think Jackson has done a relatively good job with taking that sort of approach to The Lord of the Rings. I'm not sure that the Narnia movies quite reach that quality. I think that because Lewis's work has been is so striking, and that's part of why you're seeing play adaptations all the time. I mean, those are going around the country, and I was just part of this wonderful former student of Diana Gleyer's is trying to make a musical out of Till We Have Faces. So we had a table read of a first draft of a script. I think that if the director and the author and the screenwriter are faithful to at least the ideas and have a good understanding, that I think that most of those things that have been popular books could probably see some kind of adaptation, even if it's somewhat perpendicular.
Yeah, of course, we do have to have the is this on? We do have to have the faith, the attention to the original text, I think, is the key. So let's see, another question. Someone out there in the audience. Yes, down here.
Michael Ward, you earlier in the discussion, you said Christian conversion is a joke in C.S. Lewis' eyes, and I sort of didn't understand your point in that, and I sort of was hoping you could expand further in the comedy behind Christian conversion.
Yeah, well, not a joke in the sense of being, flippant and silly, but being a joke in the best sense of bringing joy, of bringing happiness out of darkness. That was what I was trying to say. Probably not very clearly, and indeed, my student I don't think is quite clear on how he's going to make that point himself. So we'll have to wait for the conclusion of his dissertation. But that was basically the point. It's not a very original point, really, but perhaps it is original in the applying of Lewis's life to that theology of humor. I think that is a fairly new approach. Yeah.
Actually, just add to that the point that in literary terms, a comedy is, like in Shakespeare, comedy is a story that has a happy ending, preferably with a wedding. So in literary terms, a comedy isn't necessarily something that's funny. So we have, for instance, Dante's journey through through hell, purgatory to heaven. It's called the Divine Comedy. It's not full of jokes. It really is quite serious. But it's a comedy because it ends with a beatific vision, and you can't get a happier ending than that. And I think that's the kind of way in which the conversion story, that arc, can be kind of laughing in the face of Satan by having the happy ending. And I think that.
I do want to say
but
that.
I think we might have some other questions. We are a little short on time, and I want to get some other questions in here if we can. I think I see one in the front.
Yeah. What do you think about the ideas of two things? One, pointing to Lewis so that people study him more, and two, expounding further on the topics that Lewis did. I guess in popular culture, I really like the C.S. Lewis doodles that somebody, I know you know him because I saw you guys together, but I forget his name. We watch those all the time. They're really great, and they kind of lead you to going back and reading the full treatment. So that's taking you directly to Lewis. I think that's great. And then other things is just taking an idea, so you don't have to take the whole thing, and just going forward and doing a project. I think I read an article somewhere where someone was talking about the movie The Room. Was it The Room? Where the lady is with her child. And they were saying that seems like it could have been taken from the theme of one of Lewis's essays, talking about the lady with the child and the pencil and trying to explain to him all these things by the pencil. So anyway, what do you think about those two different ways, leading to Lewis and then going further?
Well, I think one obvious way of going further is him sparking interest in fields that maybe people wouldn't otherwise have considered. And one of the great gifts of Lewis, I think, is to write good literary criticism, and that certainly has had an influence on me. I mean, one of the things that I so admire about Planet Narnia is that it's not only is it just a brilliant work of scholarship, but it's so readable. It's such good prose, and this is something we need more of. And I teach writing, and so I think my students will be able to attest that I insist that they be jargon-free, clear, and if possible, elegant and beautiful in their expression. And so I know for me, Lewis's example as a literary critic, he has been very helpful in pointing me towards what I'm doing. And he said once that we don't just need more Christians writing works of theology, we need more Christians writing great works in all different sorts of fields. And that really has been, my approach in writing a book about Tolkien. So in that sense, I think Lewis is sort of pointing me toward an approach to my own scholarship.
Am I remembering correctly that if you watch the BBC Sherlock with Benedict Cumberbatch, when he goes over to his bookshelf, there's a copy of Planet Narnia?
There is, yes.
Just another breaking in. I think that's pretty exciting.
I think of Lewis as a door and a doorway. And sometimes Lewis scholars or Lewis people are accused of hagiography, but I think that hagiography is what you write if you're writing about a practical and everyday saint. But I think that his life itself serves as a good and imitable example. But I also love the way that he opens the doors to so many other writers. So much richness I would never have gotten until I started hunting for Lewis in Tolkien, which was the only way initially, God forgive me, that I could get through Tolkien to begin with. And I see these ideas from Lewis kind of showing up in lots and lots of places. I know a guy in a rock band who was given permission to really play the loudest and hardest rock and roll he could by St. Anne's on the Hill. And I think the thing is, Lewis's popularity is because he is so continually fresh. And part of that freshness is because we haven't gotten down to the deepest of his roots. Many of the conferences I go to, we kind of skim along the surface and don't dig down deeply. But all the way down, it's true and it's good and it's drawing on living water. And I think that as we continue to explore and read, that those ideas will continue creatively interacting, like this young lady was saying, with culture as it continues to evolve.
And make sure if you're taking long trips with your children to get the Focus on the Family radio play versions of Narnia, because they bring it to life better than anything. And there's a radio play version of Screwtape that's faithful to Screwtape and yet
starring Gollum.
That's right, Gollum is
Circus.
Screwtape. And so there are other mediums that lend themselves, maybe even better than film, to C.S. Lewis.
I'm not sure this is an answer to your question, but I'm going to say it anyway. One of the things I have taken from my reading of C.S. Lewis, what I think is a good example to imitate, is in his literary criticism that he is nearly always positive. It's the power of positive criticism, constructive criticism. He's nearly always trying to rehabilitate an overlooked author or praise an under-accepted author. Hardly ever is he wanting to downgrade. He's not a flamethrower when it comes to literary criticism. I mean, he can be precise and can diagnose errors, but he's doing it for the sake of the health of our appreciation of this author, not because he just wants to, despise someone for the sake of it, to build himself up by knocking other persons down. And I think that's a really healthy attitude in academia generally, not just literary criticism. Too much academia is based on rivalry and one-upmanship. And Lewis did not have a zero-sum game approach to scholarship. The more the merrier. He was always trying to enlarge the circle and find points of agreement where he could, not fallaciously, not simplistically, but authentically, genuinely, by thrashing out real differences, but always for the sake of growing sanity and health and balance. I like that attitude about Lewis very much.
Well, in his advice about writing clearly, he says, to say the thing that you mean, the whole of it, and nothing else, That's the true art and joy of words, which we're speaking.
And I think we have time for one more question. Yes, one more question.
So I've heard a lot of discussion about the carol stories within this context of children, and that they are fairy tales which indirectly discuss the Christian virtues. And I was curious what your perspectives on about how to discuss these various different works within the context of it being a fairy tale to discuss with children. Like, how do we convey these ideas in a way that was intended without getting too heavy-handed?
I know one thing I love in Lewis, and we need to hear it again, is Lewis said he hated school stories, he called them. Those are the ones where you read stories in school where there's the bully, but there's the kid that gets picked on, and then suddenly he becomes the head of the school and gets back on everyone. And he said, those are the kind of stories that build up pride and arrogance, whereas true fantasy actually builds humility and a sense of awe and wonder in child readers. And I think that's what we need to draw out of children when we're taking them into a world that's bigger than they are, and it teaches them courage, but also humility and awe and wonder. What is it? The Socrates thing that education begins in wonder.
And I want to hear you answer that question, talking about the revolutionary kind of manifesto of the Inklings, talk about Tolkien and on fairy stories, because I think that essay still has so many ansers.
Well, I've got a whole lecture on that, which I'm not going to give. So sorry.
I got no deadlines.
No. Maybe next year they'll have me do a talk in March 2020 on Tolkien and on fairy stories and fantasy. But that's not tonight's lecture. But I think that to speak to that and to speak to your question, Tolkien, for instance, really felt that the very structure of fairy stories was itself redemptive, because it's echoing the happy ending that lifts our hearts in the fairy story is what he calls a faraway echo or gleam of the Evangelium, and that the incarnation is the happy ending of human history, and the resurrection is the happy ending of the incarnation. And so, even though we don't know it, when we have that lifting of the heart at a happy ending, we are responding that way because God is the author of history, and He has made history into a comedy. It's a story that has a happy ending. And so, in answer specifically to your question, I think in a great extent we can allow these stories to do their good work in building virtue if we just simply let them be. I think we can sometimes be too analytical. And it's what Tolkien called cutting open the ball to find the bounce. Now that doesn't mean that we can't analyze. Far from it. And Tolkien himself had a very analytical mind. So did Lewis. Literary criticism is something that both of them did. But we have to also find joy in things and appreciate them and enjoy them, and not always be trying to figure out how they work. We also have to find time to play with the ball, not just figure out why it bounces. And so I think with the stories like the Narnia Chronicles, I read those as a child when I was not a Christian, did not know they were about Jesus at all, and it was only many, many years later as an adult that I became a Christian, and yet I had taken in something really meaningful from those tales, and nobody had pointed out the moral truths in them, but they were there, very profoundly there. And I think that when we have children in particular, but even adults, when we're reading great literature, there's a time for enjoyment and there's a time for contemplation. There's a time to analyze it and figure out how it's working and understand it, but there's also a time to just take it in. And I think that we need to have a little bit more patience with the taking in stage of it, especially for children. We don't have to have them recite the moral after they've heard the story. And so I want to give Michael the last word, either on this comment or on anything else that he would like to add.
Thank you. Well, I just will try and answer your question insofar as I understand it. But Lewis's works, his fictional works, his poetic works, we haven't said enough about his poetry tonight. They convey ideas, sure, but I'm not sure that they were written principally, solely to convey ideas. They were written to tell stories. And stories inevitably convey ideas, whether you mean to convey them or not. I think it was T.S. Eliot who said, we're influenced by works of art, whether we intend to be or not. And all works of art do influence us, whether they intend to or not. So I think the key thing for Lewis was, the writing of the work with its own integrity as a story, distinct from any message it may have. In Experiment in Criticism, he talks about the work of art as something made, the poema, and as something said, the logos. And we too quickly jump to the logos. We want to work out what it says. And does it say the right thing? Is it the safe thing? Is it appropriate to give it to our children to read in our churches? Without giving due attention to the thing made, the work of art. And so we end up, if we're not careful, exchanging our birthright as readers for a pot of message. Not a mess of pottage, but a pot of message.
Well, please join me in thanking all of our panelists and Michael Ward in particular for your time tonight.